The Museum Society, London, the 20th of April, 1900. Dear Mr. Carswell, I have received your letter of the 18th of April. The Museum Society is not interested in your book on magic. I told you this in my earlier letters. Please do not write to me again. I will not reply to any more of your letters. Yours sincerely, C. Dunning, Secretary. Mr. Dunning finished writing and signed the letter. Carswell had written a book on magic. He wanted to give it to the Museum Society to keep in their library. Dunning was the secretary of the society. He thought that the book was nonsense. He did not want Carswell's book in the Museum Society library. 2 days later, Dunning was going home on a tram. He was tired. He looked at the advertisements in the tram. Advertisements for soap, chocolate, and biscuits. There was a strange notice opposite him. It was written in large blue letters. In memory of John Harrington. Died the 18th of September, 1899. He was given 3 months to live. Dunning touched it. It was part of the window. It was inside the glass of the window. Dunning looked again. The notice had disappeared. The next day he was walking along Piccadilly. A man came up to Dunning and gave him a piece of paper. Dunning suddenly felt cold. He looked at the piece of paper. There was a name on it. The name was written in large blue letters. Harrington. Dunning did not have time to read any more. The man took the paper out of Dunning's hand and ran away. He disappeared into the crowd. Dunning was surprised. Dunning went into the British Museum reading room and sat down at a desk. He took some papers out of his briefcase and started to read. A large man with a round face walked past the desk. He knocked Dunning's papers onto the floor. "I am very sorry," he said, and picked up the papers. He handed the papers to Dunning and said, "These are yours, I believe." Dunning was angry. "Yes, thank you, sir," he said, and took the papers. He suddenly felt cold. The man with the round face gave an evil smile. He left the reading room quickly. Dunning felt unwell and decided to go home. Mr. Farrer, a friend of Dunning, came across the room. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked. "No, I'm not feeling well," Dunning replied. "What did that man say to you?" Farrer asked. "Do you know him?" "No, I don't," Dunning said. "That man's name is Carswell," said Farrer. "He's an evil man." Dunning was surprised. "Why do you say that?" he asked. "It's a long story," Farrer said. "Let's go and have lunch together." Dunning put his papers in his briefcase. The two men left the reading room and walked out into the street. Dunning soon felt better. As they were eating lunch, Farrer told Dunning about Carswell. "I live near Mr. Carswell," he said. "Carswell owns a big house with a park called Lufford Abbey. The village children often played in the park. Carswell didn't like children playing in the park. He chased them from the park many times, but they always came back. One day, Carswell invited all the village children to a tea party. The schoolmaster was very surprised. He took the children to Lufford Abbey after school. Carswell gave a film show. The first film showed a wolf with long teeth and sharp claws. Carswell made horrible animal noises, and the younger children started to cry. Then there was a film about a small boy in a park. It was Lufford Abbey Park, where the children liked to play. The boy was followed by a horrible white creature. The boy ran away, but the white creature caught the boy and ate him. The children were all very frightened. The children's parents were very angry with the schoolmaster and with Carswell, Farrar went on. But Carswell got what he wanted. No children play in Lufford Abbey Park any more. How horrible, said Dunning. Then he asked more slowly, Do you, or did you know, Mr. John Harrington? You mean John Harrington who died last year? Farrar asked. Yes, said Dunning. Tell me, how did Harrington die? He fell out of a tree, said Farrar. Out of a tree? How strange. What was he doing in a tree? Dunning asked. No one knows, Farrar said. John Harrington was going along a country road late at night. The police said he was running. He dropped his hat and climbed a tree. Then he fell out of the tree and broke his neck. How do you know the story so well? Said Dunning. I heard the story from his brother, Henry, said Farrar. You remember Henry Harrington, don't you? You were at university together. Henry lives not far from here, in Piccadilly. Dunning went straight home after lunch. He found a note on the door of his house. It was from his doctor. Dear Dunning, bad news. Both your servants are ill. I believe they ate some bad fish. They are in hospital. Please come to my house. Dr. Mallows. Dunning went to Dr. Mallows' house. The doctor told him what had happened. Your servants bought some fish from a man in the street, the doctor said. They told me the man was selling fish to all the houses in the street. It is strange, but no one else is ill.
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
Dunning spent the evening at Dr. Mallows' house. It was nearly midnight when he went home. He was alone in the house. He went to bed, but he could not sleep. He heard noises, small noises, clocks ticking, doors creaking. He thought he heard noises on the stairs. Was someone coming up the stairs? He got out of bed and put his ear to the door. He heard nothing. He opened the door. He stood looking and listening in the dark. A warm wind came into the house. The wind moved past his legs like a cat. He turned on the light switch. Nothing happened. The electricity was not working. Dunning kept a candle beside his bed and a box of matches under his pillow. He went to the bed and put his hand under the pillow. He did not feel a box of matches, but he felt a mouth with sharp teeth and fur. He was so frightened that he ran out of the room. He locked himself in another bedroom. All through the night he listened for noises outside the door. He could not sleep. In the morning he opened the door carefully. He looked in his bedroom. He saw nothing unusual, but he was still very frightened. He decided not to stay in the house. He dressed quickly, packed a suitcase, and went to stay at a hotel in Piccadilly. He sent a message to Mr. Henry Harrington. Harrington came to the hotel in the evening. They ate dinner together. Dunning told Harrington about the strange things that had happened. He asked Henry about his brother, John Harrington. My brother, Harrington began, became very strange. For 2 months he thought someone was following him. He talked about magic. Magic? Dunning said in surprise. Why did your brother talk about that? John knew a lot about magic, Harrington said. Before his trouble began, John wrote about a book on magic for a newspaper. He said the book was nonsense. The author of the book was very angry. The author's name was Carswell. Carswell? Dunning said. Do you know him? Harrington asked. Yes, I do, said Dunning. He wanted to give a book on magic to the Museum Society. I did not want it in the library. I told him that the book was nonsense. Then you are in danger, Harrington said. I believe that Carswell murdered my brother by magic. I will tell you the whole story.
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
The two men finished eating. They sat drinking brandy and smoking cigars. Carswell was very angry because John had said the book was nonsense, Henry Harrington went on. Then one evening, something strange happened. John went to a concert. He dropped his program. A man picked it up and gave it back to him. When John came home, he opened the program. There was a piece of paper inside. Strange red and black letters were written on the paper. John showed it to me. This happened last June, Henry Harrington said. The weather was so cold that we had a fire burning. We were looking at the paper when suddenly the door blew open. A warm wind blew into the room. The piece of paper was blown into the fire. It was completely burnt in a moment. A warm wind? On a cold night? Dunning said. Yes, I remember it clearly, said Harrington. It was like something coming into the room. From that night, John had strange dreams. He thought that someone was following him. He didn't want to go out. He kept the lights on in the house and didn't want to be alone. And did you see who was following him? Dunning asked. No, I didn't, Harrington replied. But I saw one other unusual thing. It was a calendar. It came in the post. Every date after the 18th of September was cut out. And what was the date of the concert? Dunning asked. It was the 18th of June, 3 months before my brother died, Harrington said. And your brother died on the 18th of September on a country road? Dunning asked. Yes, said Harrington. He was running away from something. The police say he broke his neck when he fell from the tree, but I think he died of fright. But you told me he was afraid to go out of the house, Dunning said. Why was he walking along a country road at night? Because about 10 days before he died, the trouble stopped, Harrington said. John felt well. Nothing was following him. He decided to go to the country for a rest. I see, said Dunning. Did your brother think Carswell was making this trouble? Yes, he did, Harrington replied. John remembered Carswell's book on magic. The book told of a way of killing enemies. A magician gives a paper with magic writing on it to his enemy. A devil or demon follows the enemy and kills him. But can the person escape? Dunning asked. Yes, he can, said Harrington. He can escape if he gives the paper back to the magician. My brother couldn't do this because the paper had been burnt. So you must be very careful. You must not take anything from Carswell. But I have, Dunning said and stood up. He handed me my papers in the museum. Then we must look at those papers immediately, said Harrington. The two men went quickly to Dunning's empty house. The servants were still unwell. The electricity was still not working. The house was in darkness. Dunning lit a candle. He was afraid. He thought that there was someone in the house. Someone was waiting for him. He opened his briefcase and took out his papers. He had not looked at them since he left the museum. He looked through the papers. Suddenly, something moved. A piece of paper jumped into the air and flew towards the candle. Henry Harrington was quick. He caught the paper before it was burnt. He looked at it by the light of the candle. He saw the strange black and red letters. "Look at the writing," he said to Dunning. "It's the same as the writing on the paper given to my brother." "What do we do now?" Dunning said. "We must give the paper back to Carswell," Harrington said. "What day did you get it?" "Yesterday," Dunning said. "The 23rd of April." "Then we have 3 months," said Henry. "We have until the 23rd of July.
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
Harrington paid detectives to watch Carswell. Carswell was in Lufford Abbey. He never came out. The problem was how to get into Lufford Abbey, or how to get Carswell out. There was no way of getting in. No visitors ever came to Lufford Abbey. They tried to get Carswell out of Lufford Abbey. They sent invitations to Carswell. They put other people's names on the invitations. They invited Carswell to dinners and to meetings. Carswell refused all the invitations. He never left Lufford Abbey. April passed, and so did June, and most of July. On the 20th of July, Dunning knew he was going to die. He wrote letters to his friends, and he wrote his will. That evening, a telegram came from the detectives who were watching Carswell's house. "Carswell leaving Victoria Station by boat train for France on Thursday night, 22nd July. Now we can find a way of giving the paper back to Carswell," Harrington told Dunning. "We can get on the train and sit near him." "But I must give the paper back myself," said Dunning. "Carswell knows me. How can I do it?" "Listen," said Harrington. "I have a plan. You must wear a false beard and different clothes. I will get on the train at Victoria Station. I will find Carswell and sit near him. The boat train stops at Croydon. You will get on the train at Croydon and sit near me. We will be on the train together with Carswell. We will find a way of giving him the paper." Dunning waited at Croydon railway station. He was worried. The boat train was late. When the train arrived, Harrington was looking out of a window. Dunning got on the train. Harrington was sitting in the same carriage as Carswell. Dunning sat down and opened a book. The paper was inside the cover of the book. Dunning did not look at Harrington, but Carswell looked at both men carefully. Dunning was wearing a false beard and a large hat. Carswell stood up. He left his coat on the seat. He went out into the corridor to smoke a cigar. Dunning was going to pick up the coat, but Carswell turned round suddenly. He looked at Dunning very carefully, then sat down again. The minutes passed. The train was getting nearer and nearer to Dover. Dunning was hot and frightened. How could he give the paper back to Carswell?
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
The ticket collector came down the corridor. He looked at Dunning's ticket from Croydon. Carswell took out a wallet and showed his ticket. He put the wallet on top of his coat. Harrington stood up and knocked Carswell's coat onto the floor. Carswell's wallet also fell onto the floor. "I'm very sorry," Harrington said, and picked up the coat. At the same time, he kicked the wallet towards Dunning. He held out the coat to Carswell and said, "Here you are." Carswell did not take the coat. He looked at Harrington with a look of hate. Dunning picked up the wallet from the floor while Carswell looked at Harrington. Harrington put the coat down on the seat beside Carswell. Then he turned and showed his ticket to the ticket collector. As the ticket collector left, Carswell jumped up and followed him. "Excuse me," he said. "Can I get a porter at Dover to take my luggage to the boat?" "Of course, sir," the ticket collector said. "We'll be at Dover in 5 minutes." Dunning quickly put the paper in Carswell's wallet. Then he dropped the wallet on the floor. Carswell came back to the carriage. "Is this yours, sir?" Dunning asked, picking up the wallet. Carswell looked at the wallet in Dunning's hand. "Thank you very much," he said, and he took the wallet. He did not pick up his coat. The train slowed down. The carriage became dark. A warm wind started to blow. The train stopped at Dover station. Carswell got off the train as soon as it stopped. "Porter!" he shouted. A porter came running. "Porter, take my luggage and my coat to the ship." He looked back at Harrington and gave an evil smile. Then he walked towards the boat. Dunning and Harrington waited on the platform of the station. The porter took Carswell's luggage to the boat. They heard an officer say, "I'm sorry, sir, you can't take an animal on the ship." Then a moment later, "I'm sorry, sir, I thought you had an animal with you. I see it's only a coat." Carswell got on the ship for France. Dunning and Harrington took the train back to London. 2 days later, a notice appeared in the Times newspaper. Abbeville, France, the 23rd of July, 1900. There was an accident today at St. Wolfram's Church. An English traveller fell from the church tower. He died immediately. The traveller's name was Mr. Carswell, of Lufford Abbey.
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
At universities in England, May is the month of examinations. Paul was lying on the grass in front of the examination hall. His friends, Sheila and Charles, were sitting near him. The three of them were first-year students at university. They were sitting their first-year exams. Paul and Charles were 19, and Sheila was a year younger. The next exam began in half an hour's time. But the three students were not talking about the next examination. They were talking about their holidays. "Where are you going this summer?" Sheila asked Paul. "To Wales," Paul replied. "I'm going to stay in a cottage in the country." "You have a cottage in Wales?" asked Charles. "It's not my cottage," replied Paul. "It belongs to my uncle. He usually goes there for his holidays every summer. But this year he's going to Greece, and I'm going to stay in his cottage for 2 months, July and August." "Where are you going for your holidays?" Paul asked. "We don't know," replied Sheila. "We haven't decided yet." "Why don't you both come to Wales?" said Paul. "You can stay with me for a week or 2. "What do you think, Charles?" asked Sheila. The college bell rang loudly. It was time for the next examination. "We'll talk about it after this exam," Charles replied. "Let's go now." The students got up from the grass. They picked up their notebooks and hurried towards the examination hall. 3 hours later, the examination was over. Paul, Sheila and Charles were sitting in a cafe. "What's your uncle's cottage like?" Sheila asked Paul. Paul took a photograph out of his wallet. "It looks lovely," said Sheila. "It is lovely," agreed Paul, "but it's very lonely. There are no houses near the cottage, and there's no electricity and no telephone." "Oh, let's go and stay with Paul," Sheila said to Charles. "OK," agreed Charles. "We can stay there for a week." The 3 students made arrangements for their holiday in Wales. "Come on the 5th of August," said Paul. "That's a Monday. The train from London arrives at Llanfoy station at 1:30. "Where's Llanfoy?" asked Sheila. "It's a small railway station near the cottage," answered Paul. "Fast trains from London stop there." "How do we get from the station to the cottage?" asked Charles. "Look, I'll draw a map," said Paul. "The railway line goes through a long tunnel before Llanfoy station. The cottage is on the hill above this tunnel." Charles gave Paul his diary. Paul drew a map and wrote down the name and address of the cottage. "There you are," said Paul. "But don't worry, I'll meet you at Llanfoy station. I'll see you there on Monday the 5th of August at 1:30. It is the 5th of August. Sheila and Charles arrive at Llanfoy station in Wales. Here we are, Llanfoy. Where's Paul? He's late. Let's walk to the cottage. Oh, he'll be here soon. Just then, a soldier walked past. "Excuse me, is there a cafe near here?" Yes, outside the station." "Charles, what's in those bags?" "I don't know."
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
Sheila and Charles went into the small cafe. There was a young girl behind the counter. Sheila went up to her. "Has a young man been in here this morning?" asked Sheila. "A soldier?" asked the young girl. "No, not a soldier, a student," replied Sheila. "Oh, we see a lot of soldiers here," said the girl, "but no students." Charles asked for 2 coffees. He sat down with Sheila at a table near the window. "Paul's forgotten about our visit," he said. "We'll have a coffee, then we'll walk to Hilltop Cottage." They sat at the table and looked out of the window. Some soldiers were loading bags into the lorry. Other soldiers were standing on guard. The girl brought the coffees. "What's in those bags?" Charles asked her. "Banknotes," replied the girl. "The money comes from London by train. Then the soldiers take it to a large army camp near here." "What do they do with the money?" Sheila asked. "I don't know," said the girl, and she walked away. "They're probably old banknotes," said Charles. "After some years the government destroys old banknotes and new money is printed. The money in those bags will not be used anymore." Charles and Sheila waited in the cafe. Paul did not come. It was now after 2 o'clock. They left the cafe and walked to a crossroads. Charles looked at Paul's map. Sheila pointed to a signpost. "That's the road to Barcony," she said. They pulled their rucksacks onto their shoulders and walked along the road. It was a very hot day. The sun was shining brightly, and they walked slowly. After an hour, they came to a telephone box. On the left, there was a narrow lane into the woods. "The telephone box is on Paul's map," said Charles. "This is the way to the cottage." They walked up the narrow lane. Tall trees grew on each side. The branches were thick with leaves. "It's dark in here," said Charles. "There's no sun." "It's nice and cool after the hot road," replied Sheila. "Anyway, Paul's cottage is higher up. It'll be brighter up there." They walked farther up the steep, dark lane. "I don't like this place," said Charles. "It's too dark. What a place for a holiday." "Oh, come on," said Sheila. Sheila and Charles arrived at the cottage. There were high trees all round it. "There's something wrong," said Charles. "Look at the curtains. They're all closed. There's no one here." "Don't be silly," said Sheila. She went up to the cottage and knocked loudly on the door. They waited for some time. Sheila pushed at the cottage door. It did not open. It was locked. "Paul?" shouted Charles. "Paul, are you there?" There was no reply. Sheila knocked again on the door. They stood and listened. "There's someone inside," said Sheila. "I heard a noise. Listen." They both stood in silence. Someone unlocked the door. "It's Paul," said Charles. "Why is he taking so long?" The door slowly opened. A tall man with a beard stood in the doorway. He was about 40 years old. Sheila and Charles did not know him. He was a stranger. "Who are you?" asked the stranger. "What do you want?"
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
Sheila looked up at the tall man. "Is Paul in?" she asked. "Paul?" said the stranger. "There's no one here with that name. You've made a mistake." The stranger slowly closed the door. "But this cottage belongs to Paul's uncle," said Sheila. "We saw it in a photograph." "It was another cottage in your photograph," said the man. "It wasn't this one. This cottage is mine. I live here." The man was becoming angry. "You've made a mistake," he shouted. "I don't like visitors here. Go away." The door closed with a loud bang. Sheila turned away from the door. She saw a piece of paper under a bush. She stopped and quickly picked up the paper. "We've made a mistake," said Charles. "Paul isn't here. We've come to the wrong cottage. Let's go back to the road." They walked back down the lane. After a few minutes, Sheila stopped. The cottage was now behind the trees. Sheila opened the piece of paper and looked at it in surprise. "We haven't made a mistake," she said to Charles. "Look at this." Charles took the paper and looked at it. "It's an examination paper," he said. "It's our exam paper. We sat this exam in May." "Paul sat this exam too. So Paul is here." Something is wrong. "Look, there's an old building. We'll wait there." "But what are we going to do?" "We'll go back to the cottage tonight. We must find Paul." "Listen, I can hear a noise. It's a lorry. It's coming up the lane to the cottage."
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
Sheila and Charles waited in the old building. Slowly it became dark. They walked quietly back to the cottage and hid behind a bush. A lorry was parked near the cottage door. They waited quietly in the darkness. Suddenly a man hurried up the lane. He knocked at a window of the cottage. The door opened quickly. Everything is okay, Frank, said the man outside. Bill has telephoned from London. He's put sleeping pills in the guard's coffee. Good, said Frank. We can start now. Get the bags out of the lorry and into the cottage. What's happening? Charles asked Sheila. Bill's put sleeping pills in the guard's coffee. What does that mean? And what's in those bags? I don't know, said Sheila. Listen, they're talking again. What about that young man? One of the men asked Frank. We'll leave him in the upstairs bedroom, Frank replied. He's tied up tightly. He'll be found tomorrow. By then, we'll be far from here. Paul's in the cottage, Sheila whispered to Charles, and he's a prisoner. 4 men carried all the bags into the cottage. They closed the door behind them and locked it. Paul's in one of the upstairs bedrooms, said Sheila. We must help him. How are you going to get into the cottage? Asked Charles. They've locked the door. I'll climb up onto the top of the porch, said Sheila. Then I'll get in through a window. Sheila and Charles waited for half an hour. Then they walked up quietly to the front door. There were no lights in the cottage. Help me up, Charles, said Sheila. Sheila stood on top of the porch. She reached up and pulled at the window. It opened slowly and made a loud noise. Sheila waited for a few moments. Nothing happened. She opened the window wide. The curtains inside were closed. She opened them carefully and climbed into the bedroom. In the dark room, Paul was lying on a bed. He was tied up tightly, and there was a gag over his mouth. Sheila quickly took off the gag. Shh, she said. Don't make a noise. There are some men downstairs. It's all right, said Paul. They won't hear us. They're not in the cottage. They're out at the back. Sheila slowly untied the ropes round Paul. What's happening? She asked him. Who are those men? What are they doing? They're going to rob a train tonight. Rob a train? Asked Sheila in surprise. They found an old shaft behind the cottage, said Paul. The shaft goes down into the railway tunnel. They're going to change the signal in the tunnel. The signal light will be red and the train will stop. Now I understand, said Sheila. Someone has put sleeping pills in the guard's coffee. That's part of their plan, said Paul. The train will stop in the tunnel and the guard will be asleep. The men will steal the bags of money from the train and escape up the shaft. But these men have taken bags into the cottage, said Sheila. What are they for? The bags are full of paper, said Paul. They look like the bags of money. The soldiers won't find the paper until tomorrow morning. Then these men will be far away from here. We can run down to the telephone box, said Sheila. We can telephone the police from there. There isn't enough time, said Paul. We have to stop these men. We can put heavy stones over the shaft. Then the men can't get out. And Charles can run down and telephone the police, said Sheila. Now all the knots were untied and Paul was free. They climbed out of the window. Charles was waiting for them in the darkness.
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
The train from London was in the long tunnel. The signal is red, said the driver to his mate. That's unusual. The train slowed down. It stopped on a long bend in the tunnel. The driver's mate looked back. The end of the train was out of sight. What about the money in the guard's van? The mate asked the driver. Don't worry, replied the driver. Pete's a good guard. The driver watched the signal. It was red. The train waited in the long tunnel. Frank and his men were in the tunnel. They were waiting at the bottom of the shaft. The train slowed down and stopped. The guard's van was in front of them. Frank quickly climbed up. He opened the lock on the door of the guard's van. He looked inside. "It's all right," he said to the others. "The guard has drunk the coffee. He's sleeping." Frank threw down the bags of money. "Throw up the bags of paper," he told his men, "and move quickly. We haven't much time." A few minutes later, Frank and his men were at the bottom of the shaft. They were carrying the bags of money. "Get up to the cottage," Frank said. "I'll follow you in a moment." The signal changed from red to green. The train moved towards Llanvoy station. "Good," thought Frank. "The plan has worked." At the top of the shaft, Sheila and Paul were working fast in the darkness. There was a heavy iron cover at the entrance to the shaft. They pulled the cover over the entrance and put some heavy stones on top of it. The first of Frank's men reached the top of the shaft. His head hit the iron cover. He reached up with one hand and pushed. The cover did not move. "There's something wrong!" he shouted. "I can't get out!" Below him in the shaft, the other men waited. They were trapped.
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished.
The police moved quickly. A police car came to the telephone box. Charles jumped in and they drove fast towards the cottage. The police arrested 2 men at the top of the shaft. An hour later, Sheila, Paul and Charles were in the police station at Barcony. "Thanks to you, we've got the men and the money," said the police sergeant. "We arrested the other 2 men at Llanvoy station." "But there were 5 men," said Paul. "Have you arrested the leader? He's called Frank." Sheila, Charles and Paul spent the night in the home of the police sergeant. The next morning, the sergeant left early. "I must go to the police station," he told them. "I'll phone you later in the morning." At breakfast, Sheila turned on the radio. "Here is a police message. The police are looking for Frank Steele, aged 40. This man was last seen on the railway line to Llanvoy station in the early hours of this morning. He is a dangerous—" Sheila turned off the radio. "It's a strange beginning to a holiday," she said. Later the phone rang. Paul answered it. It was the sergeant. "Good news," said the sergeant. "A police car has picked up Frank Steele." Paul put down the phone. "The police have arrested Frank Steele," he said to the other 2. "That's great," said Sheila. "Now we can go back to the cottage and begin our holiday."
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.